Is Belarus preparing to enter the war? On May 12th, Belarus's president and Mr. Whipple impersonator Lukashenko said he will selectively mobilize military units to prepare them for war. 3 days later, Zelenskyy warned that Russia may be planning operations from Belarusian territory against northern Ukraine or against a NATO country. Belarus is already hosting Russian tactical nuclear weapons and Oreshnik hypersonic missiles, and Russian drones are already using the Belarus-Ukraine border as a routing corridor to reach western Ukrainian cities. So the question is simple. Is Belarus about to enter the war? Well, the answer is more complicated than the question, and honestly, more dangerous. Hey friends, Wes here, Army, Infantry, and Air Force veteran, and every few months, Belarus rattles the saber. Lukashenko moves troops, Russia sends signals, Ukraine reinforces the north, NATO planners start staring at maps of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia with the kind of expression usually reserved for colonoscopies. Then, things quiet down and everyone goes back to watching the Eastern Front. This time feels different. Here's why. On May 12th, Lukashenko met with his defense minister Viktor Krenin following a broad readiness inspection of Belarusian armed forces. His public statement was not subtle. He said Belarus will selectively mobilize units to prepare them for war. That's not a declaration of invasion, but it's also not background noise. That's a head of state publicly shifting from performative military theater into rotational mobilization language. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Staff Border Guard Service reported on May 4th that Belarus is developing logistics routes, training grounds, and military infrastructure in cooperation with Russia. Their official assessment? No immediate invasion force visible, but the infrastructure could be activated by Russia at any time. Then, Zelenskyy on May 15th warned that Russia is actively trying to pull Belarus deeper into the war and may be considering operations from Belarusian territory toward Kyiv or a NATO country. Zelenskyy ordered additional fortifications. And on May 2nd, a Russian signal relay balloon entered Ukrainian airspace from Belarus, reportedly to boost guidance signals for Russian strike weapons. Modern war doesn't always announce itself with a tank column. Sometimes it floats in on a balloon. Belarus isn't a hypothetical threat. It was an active launch pad. In February of 2022, Russian forces used the Belarusian territory as the northern axis of its invasion, pushing south toward Kyiv, Hostomel, Irpin, Bucha, and Chernihiv. The strategic logic was straightforward. Hit Ukraine from multiple directions simultaneously, move fast enough to prevent a coherent defense, and force a surrender before the West could organize a response. Well, it failed. Russian armored columns ran into Ukrainian resistance, catastrophic logistics failures because the Russian military is deeply corrupt, and the inconvenient reality that Ukrainian soldiers don't surrender on schedule. Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine by late March 2022, which is smart because they would have been annihilated. The Kyiv offensive collapsed, but the geography didn't change. Belarus still sits directly north of Kyiv. The border is 670 miles long, and every Ukrainian soldier guarding that border is a soldier not fighting in the east or the south. That's the geometry Putin is working with. He doesn't need a second Kyiv offensive. He needs Ukraine to keep garrisoning the north. So what's happening now? Well, Lukashenko's selective mobilization announcement is piece one. Belarus is also updating its state armament program for 2026 to 2030 with specific emphasis on drones, electronic warfare, communication systems, and stuff suited to Belarusian terrain. That's not procurement for expeditionary operations in a desert. That's procurement for forested, swampy, borderland warfare on terrain that runs right to Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania, and Latvia. Piece two is the infrastructure. Ukrainian border officials report new logistics routes, artillery positions, training grounds, and military road construction in cooperation with Russia. The border services language is careful. Not an invasion force yet, but a usable platform. Piece three is the airspace. Russian Shahed drones have reportedly flown along the Belarus-Ukraine border, 5 to 10 kilometers inside Ukrainian airspace to reach deeper into western Ukraine without crossing Belarusian territory officially. The May 13th strike on western Ukraine involved activity near NATO borders, with Moldova reporting a separate drone incursion and Poland scrambling fighters. Belarus's drone war is already shaping attacks on cities hundreds of kilometers away. Now, piece 4 is the weapons. Belarus now hosts Russian tactical nuclear weapons and Oreshnik hypersonic missiles. Lukashenko didn't build those. Putin placed them there. That means Belarus is no longer just a convenient staging area. It's part of Russia's coercive infrastructure against Ukraine and NATO simultaneously. And I can tell you the most dangerous threat is the one that doesn't look like an attack. Signal relay balloons, drone routing corridors, logistics and road networks, and rotational mobilization drills don't produce the kind of visual indicators that get attention, but they do produce gradual capability. And gradual capability, assembled quietly over months, is exactly what Russia used in Belarus before February of 2022. The challenge for analysts is separating the theater from the infrastructure. Right now, Belarus is producing both. And here's the honest counter-argument, and it's real. Belarus's military is not Russia's army. It's smaller, less combat-hardened, and politically fragile, and ways Lukashenko understands better than anyone. He survived 2020 because Putin propped him up. He knows sending Belarusian troops into Ukraine could destabilize him domestically in ways that don't end with a comfortable retirement. Ukraine has also fortified the north since 2022. Mines, trenches, anti-tank obstacles, drone coverage, and prepared defensive positions. Any new push toward Kyiv would enter a very different environment than February of 2022. The shock and speed model failed once. Running it again into a prepared defense is a different proposition. And Ukraine's border service has been explicit. The current Russian troop presence in Belarus does not constitute an immediate direct invasion threat. Their words, not mine. And there's no public evidence of a logistical signature that preceded 2022. Field hospitals, bridging units, fuel depots, ammunition trains, heavy rail movement, and air defense architecture at invasion scale, that doesn't exist yet. But here's where the real argument lives, and it's scarier than the invasion version. Putin may not need Belarus to invade. He needs Belarus to be useful. And Belarus is already doing the job. It's forcing Ukraine to garrison the north. It's hosting Russian strategic weapons that threaten NATO. It's supporting drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. It's sitting above the Slovakia Gap, that narrow land corridor between Belarus and Kaliningrad that NATO planners consider one of the alliance's most vulnerable geographic points. Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia all live in the shadow of that map. Belarus is what you'd call a ghost front. Not fully active, not quiet, armed, watched, politically chained to Moscow, and just dangerous enough that Ukraine can't ignore it. That's the elegant part of this strategy from Moscow's perspective. A real northern front would cost Russia enormously in men and equipment and logistics. A credible northern threat costs almost nothing, forces Ukrainian dispersion, complicates NATO planning, and keeps the pressure diffuse. But let's talk about the upcoming summer, because it adds another layer. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign is now reaching Moscow. On May 17th, Ukraine carried out one of its largest overnight strikes on Moscow in more than a year, with debris landing near Moscow's largest airport. Zelenskyy confirmed Ukrainian drones struck targets more than 500 kilometers from the border through dense Russian air defenses. Now, the Institute for the Study of War assessed that Ukraine's campaign shows Russia cannot reliably defend major cities and economic infrastructure in European Russia. Putin is under visible pressure at home. When that happens, he reaches for escalation options that shift attention and complicate his adversary's decision-making, moving forces around Belarus, rattling Lukashenko into mobilization language, routing drones near NATO borders, and making Zelenskyy warn about a possible second front. That's a cheap way to widen the map without committing to a second invasion. If you want to know whether this crosses from pressure tool into genuine northern offensive threat, well, here's the checklist. Large Russian ground formations moving into Belarus, field hospitals, blood supplies, bridging equipment, pontoon units, fuel depots, ammunition stockpiles, Belarusian mobilization expanding from selective rotational training into broad call-ups, air defense and electronic warfare systems shifting south toward Ukraine. I'm out of fingers. Russian aircraft dispersing to Belarusian bases, and critically, Belarusian state media shifting from defensive readiness language to narratives about Ukrainian aggression or false flag incidents on the border. That last indicator is important. Before Russian escalation, the Kremlin typically builds a moral pretext nobody outside Russian state television believes. It's the geopolitical equivalent of setting your own couch on fire and then blaming the neighbor's cat. If you start seeing that kind of narrative coming out of Minsk, the threat calculus has shifted. Is Belarus preparing to enter the war? Yes, in the sense that Lukashenko's own government says it's preparing military units for war, modernizing drone and electronic warfare capabilities, and building infrastructure in cooperation with Russia. No, in the sense that the public evidence doesn't yet show an invasion-scale force capable of a second drive on Kyiv. The right question isn't whether Lukashenko's personally leading a tank column south in a field marshal costume from a Minsk theater department. The right question is whether Putin needs that to happen. He doesn't. Belarus is already doing the job. It threatens Ukraine from the north, it hosts Russian strategic weapons, it supports the drone war against Ukrainian cities, and it pressures NATO's eastern flank from Poland to Lithuania to Latvia, and forces Kyiv to keep soldiers, mines, drones, and air defenses pointed at a border that may never produce a formal offensive. That's the more dangerous story, not the cartoon invasion, the quiet platform. Putin doesn't need Belarus to conquer Kyiv. He needs Belarus to make Ukraine keep looking over its shoulder. In modern war, that may be enough. That's it for today, my friends. Subscribing is free, and it genuinely helps the channel, so consider it. And for the deeper reads, including the weekly geopolitical intelligence brief, I'm over at wesodonnell.com on Substack. And before I forget, I just published a book review on this book by James Verini called The Theater. And let me tell you, it's a great read about Russian war crimes in Mariupol. I'm going to zoom into it right here so you can get a decent look at the cover. It is coming out this week. Take a look if you get a chance. I don't get any money for recommending you this book. I just enjoyed it, and I think my audience would enjoy it also. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.